Professor. It's so wonderful you could join me today. I would love for you to introduce yourself to our listeners, those who don't yet know your work and how it influenced the history of Anne Boleyn. So could you please introduce yourself?
Certainly. My name is JoAnn DellaNeva, and I'm a recently retired professor of French literature at the University of Notre Dame, where I taught for over 40 years. I'm a specialist in literature of the early modern period, so that's the 16th and 17th centuries, and especially a specialist in poetry. Trained as a literary scholar, not as a historian, I hasten to add there, but my avocation is Tudor history. And that was an interest that I developed thanks to positions that I held at Notre Dame Center in London. I had the opportunity to live and work there for 5 years, and that's where I developed this interest in Tudor history. So the work that I do combines my actual academic specialty and my interest, my avocation in Tudor history. So what I have done, wrote and translated a book on Lancelot de Carle, which is entitled The Story of the Death of Anne Boleyn. It's a long poem. We can talk obviously a lot more about this poem, but it's a long poem written in French. And that's the main published work that I've done on the intersection of French literature and Tudor history. But although I'm retired, I'm continuing to write, and my most recent work focuses on imaginative representations of the people and the events surrounding the court of Henry VIII in French and Italian literature. I've recently done some work on Anne Boleyn's life in France, and at the moment I'm working on a longer presentation, which I hope to turn into a book, on representations of Mary Tudor, Queen of France, in French and Italian literature.
Wonderful. And I'm really looking forward to delving deeper into some of those things you've started to work on. Your work is also crucial to understanding why Anne has fallen victim to dubious tropes, which some people, even today, I believe, might take as fact. I believe you found some of the most important reasons, if not the root cause, as to why Anne Boleyn is so often misrepresented in books and film today. So let's start with your book, the translation of the narrative poem by Lancelot de Carle, entitled The Story of the Death of Anne Boleyn. You are the first to translate this entire poem in English, which is a feat unto itself, and it has often been somewhat dismissed because it is in poetry form. So please explain to us why it is actually, as you put it, a hybrid text, and in reality serves as an important documentation regarding facts on the ground during Anne's execution.
Okay, so let's back up a little bit and maybe start by talking a little bit about who Lancelot de Carle was, because that's critical to the understanding of this work as a hybrid text. So Lancelot de Carle was a young man who served as the secretary to the resident French ambassador in London at the time of Anne Boleyn's execution. Now, we don't know a whole lot about his biography. We don't know his date of birth, but like most ambassadorial secretaries, he was classically educated. He was probably a cleric in the Catholic Church, though not yet a priest. So he had probably taken minor orders in the Catholic Church. And he was in London at the time of Anne's execution. He arrived, in fact, in London shortly before the events started to unravel. And he claims explicitly to be an eyewitness to these events. So I say that the text is hybrid insofar as it is functioning as a diplomatic dispatch, because that was his job. He was the secretary to the French ambassador. So it's a dispatch sent to the French court on behalf of the ambassador. But what is unique about this as a dispatch is the fact that it is a poem. It's written in verse form. So it advertises its literary nature. It has both practical and aesthetic qualities, and they're equally important in the understanding of this text. Now, I would maintain that there's a certain tension here, right, between poetry and a diplomatic dispatch. It has never been done before nor since, and probably for good reason. Poetry is coded, I think, for all of us as something that's imaginative, that's false. A poet needs to accommodate rhyme and meter when he's writing his poem, and this affects his word choice, and all of that brings it potentially further away from the truth. I'll give you a little brief example of this. There's a famous French poet from this period who, when he was talking about the date of his first encounter with his beloved lady, which actually took place in 1545, he claims in the poem, this is a sonnet, that it was in 1546. So what's the reason for this discrepancy? Well, it's quite simple. In French, there's no rhyme word. There's no rhyme word for the word "sec," but there are plenty for "cease." And so it was pretty easy for him to change it from 1545 to 1546. He doesn't. That kind of truth is not really what's essential for him. It's the beauty of the poem that matters. So poets lie, or at least they fudge the truth a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. But diplomats, on the other hand, had to tell the truth. That was their job. It's useless to have a diplomat who doesn't tell the truth because they're depending on that person to give accurate dispatches back home. And in fact, there's a handbook for diplomats from the Renaissance period that says, just as a doctor may lie to his patient, but the patient should never lie to the doctor, so must the subject always speak the truth to his prince. So the diplomat has to say the truth. So Carle has to produce a truthful text, but he also has to be mindful of these aesthetic principles at the same time. So that's the balancing act, and that's the tension there. So you might ask, the question is, why take the time to write in verse when all that was required of him was to write a factual letter? And I have a couple of potential answers to that. One being that he was, in fact, an accomplished poet. Before he became the secretary to the French ambassador, he lived in the court of Francis I. He took place in a poetic contest just the year before he arrived in England. And so I think he fancied himself a poet. He was successful and worked side by side with some other very famous French poets at the time. So he thought of himself as a poet. So that's one good reason for writing a poem, right? Secondly, I think the text itself gives us a clue. He says very explicitly that he's absolutely shocked and saddened by these events. So he decides to write about them in verse because rhyme makes a story less troubling. And that's pretty much a direct quotation from the poem. It makes things more palatable. There's something pleasurable about reading poetry, even when the content is tragic. And later, in another poem that he wrote years later, he wrote that he wanted to write about this topic in verse because he wanted to temper the severity of the pronouncements with the sweetness of meter. So for him, poetry was a pleasurable experience, no matter how difficult, no matter how severe the content might be, no matter how tragic the content might be. So that's what he's doing here. He can't change the tragic outcome, but he can make it easier to digest.
Yes.
And then I think a third reason is that once you cast this as a literary work, as opposed to simply a dispatch, it opens the door to an emotional telling of the story. You know, poetry is an emotional experience, right? Reading it, writing it is an emotional experience. So he doesn't want to simply write a factual account. This is not a dispassionate account, but he wants to emphasize the human interest side of things and allows him to tell stories that aren't just politically interesting or important, but that talk about the people and their human qualities. There's lots of stories and vignettes in this poem that don't properly belong to a diplomatic dispatch. It's not the kind of thing you find in a dispatch. So many of the parts of this text are really quite moving. There are a lot of tears that are shed in the course of this poem. Lots of people are crying throughout the poem. And one thing that is quite interesting is that he is able to give a lot of attention to women in particular. Women who might not necessarily be the subject of simply a historical document or a diplomatic dispatch. He gives a lot of attention, for example, to Catherine, who he depicts as saintly and who endures her suffering in a very patient manner. He talks a lot about Mary, their daughter. In fact, she's the subject of about 100 lines of the poem.
Wow.
And But that's a lot. And she's not really essential to the Anne Boleyn story,
right.
or to but clearly she was of interest to him, and probably she was of interest to the French court at that time. And we know that the French still were considering her as a potential bride in the royal family. So spending that much time talking about Mary is probably something that he thought would have been of interest to the French court. So in other words, this allows him to expand beyond just the facts of the execution. One really interesting little change that he makes, for example, is he speaks about the wife and the mother of Francis Weston, who was one of the men accused of being Anne's lover, and he depicts them as making an emotional plea to the king for Weston's release. Now, other sources say that there was a plea made on behalf of Francis Weston, but they say it was a diplomatic intervention on the part of the French. But Carle retells it, he recasts it, it makes it human. For Carle, it's his family, his immediate family, his mother and his wife, two people who are very emotionally tied to Francis Weston. Not some diplomat in France who's intervened, but his very family that is doing that. So we still get the fact that, yes, interventions are being made on behalf of Weston, but the way he casts it is something that tugs at our heartstrings a little bit more, because it's personal. He has a vignette about Anne's ladies that she comforts just before she dies and who fully attend to her in her final moments. So these are just a sample of the emotional stories that he can give in this poem, none of which is essential to a diplomatic dispatch. So clearly this is a text that's intended for a wider audience than just the court in France. And those, of course, they needed facts about this unprecedented event. But the general public might have wanted these tidbits, these human interest stories. Let's put it that way.
And so do we.
So I tell you, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I tell you, it's an essentially truthful account, but with lots of literary elements present. And I think he does an excellent job of combining those two things and making this unique hybrid text.
Well, it's so fascinating on so many levels, because I feel like over time it has not been given the recognition of being on the ground in the moment and the facts simply because it is a poem. But it's interesting because hearing you talk about him using poetry as a vehicle, people have sometimes said, why did you do an Anne Boleyn paper doll book? And as you're talking just now, I'm thinking that's because that's how I process things as a child and as an artist. I would always make paper dolls. I mean, I made one of Amy Carter back in the late 70s, you know. I processed life that way. So, and it was no less truthful. So it's fascinating because I hadn't made that connection till you're talking just now, to respect his vehicle for expressing these facts makes them no less factual. And also, when you do something using your art and you're putting down facts, there is this beauty you can bring to it, like you're saying with these vignettes. And I'm curious to know your opinion on these vignettes of Catherine, of Mary, and of Anne's Ladies in Waiting, how accurate you feel they are.
Well, it's really hard to say because women were not given the kind of attention historically in documents that we might expect. And so there are not a lot of sources for us to compare. But I think there are many texts that do talk about Catherine in exactly those terms, as this patient figure who puts up with all of the terrible things that are going on around her. Even fewer documents regarding Mary, but he makes Mary out to be quite the scholar, having a very generous spirit in accepting what's happening and not gloating when she discovers that Anne Boleyn has been arrested, but also promising to take care of Elizabeth, that her daughter will not want for anything. So he wants to portray her very clearly as a sensitive, good Christian woman.
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, he has good things to say about other people as well. So it's very balanced.
Yes.
I think, his portrayal, but there's a marked interest in depicting women that I think people haven't really remarked upon very much and haven't really studied very much in that poem. But it makes it an interesting text, I think, to discuss in classes where you're talking about the representations of women in literature.
It's such a treasure, really, for that very reason.
It's very funny because although it was known primarily among the historians, the people who study literature virtually ignored it, don't know much about it. I think because there wasn't a good text available so that they could work from it. So that was, again, part of what I thought I could supply. I wanted to supply something for the historians in terms of the translation, but I wanted to supply a good edition for the scholars of French literature of the period.
Well, it's a remarkable contribution because now all of us can make an assessment ourselves and not just take for granted that, okay, this is a poem and that's it. Now we can look at it, and from the other things that you've researched, which we're going to get into, cross-referencing things and so forth, we can see how valuable it is in terms of simply being the point of view and the experiences of someone on the ground present. And to me, it makes complete sense that he would return to a artistic format that he was comfortable with. So,
yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So on that note, can you unpack the meaning of the word story for the title, the story of the death of Anne Boleyn, Queen of England? That word in French, can you unpack it for us and its different meanings? Because that's important.
Absolutely. So the manuscripts all have different titles, but the manuscript that I was working for is very clearly titled Histoire de la mort d'Anne Boleyn. So histoire in French has two meanings, and I'll tell you from the beginning. Translation is never simple. A translator, if there's no such thing as a one-to-one correspondence between words across languages and cultures. So a translator needs to make choices, and looking at the whole context of a sentence, of a paragraph, of a novel, whatever, to try to find the proper nuance to translate it into the other language. And so right from the beginning, when I faced with this title, it was the very first choice that I needed to make, was what do I do about this word histoire? Because histoire has two meanings. It means, as it looks, history as well as story. And I had to make a choice in translating this. I chose story instead of history. But in the original French, it would have brought both of those things to mind. So something to keep in mind is that from the French perspective, and probably from the perspective that we should have as well, history is a narrative. True, there's a story-like quality to narrative, and historians create narratives in order to explain certain things. So there's the definite connection between those things. And another meaning of histoire as history is a related meaning is the word biography in English. I could have translated it that way. And there's a sense that this is the first biography of Anne Boleyn, because in addition to describing this breaking news, the events that he sees, he says at the beginning he's going to tell some other things as well. He's going to give her backstory. He's going to talk about the things that he learned about her that preceded his time in London. That things that he didn't see, but things that he heard about from good, reliable sources.
Yes, and you bring up such an interesting point, because this is so key when we're trying to unpack things. It's the French view of history as narrative, where for English speakers, for the most part, we see it almost as a list of facts versus narrative. Would you say that's true? And perhaps that's why we're resistant at first to look at this poem as facts?
That's right. And it's a word that brings out both meanings at the same time. In French, not so much in English.
Yes.
One has to choose. So, yes, knowing the original language helps there. But again, as a translator, I had to choose one or the other. And I chose to emphasize the narrative quality of it rather than the historical side of things.
Right.
I think history in English would be too limiting. The story of Anne Boleyn could involve history, but it also could involve imaginative retelling.
Right. It's much more inclusive
Yes.
term. And it's so interesting because your understanding and all your years of knowledge were so important to translating this poem for that very reason, because you understand the background and the meaning behind a lot of words that someone less knowledgeable would not be able to bring to the table, which makes your translation all the more, in my opinion, more powerful.
Thank you.
So I think you already mentioned this, but when was the poem, or you mentioned when he arrived. So when was the poem actually written in context?
It was absolutely immediately as things were happening. He tells us the exact date of the poem. He adds the date of June the 2nd, 1536. As if he were writing a letter. You know, you put a date on the top of your letter. He put the date in the poem itself. So exactly 2 weeks after her execution. This is really remarkable. He doesn't sign the poem with his own name the way you would with a letter, but clearly he wanted us to know that, and everyone to know who reads his poem, it was written within 2 weeks of Anne's execution. He wants the world to know this. So he thought it was important to stress this immediacy of the poem, and I think immediacy is absolutely essential. These are raw facts that haunt him, that he's trying to process. He says that he's trying to get his head around this. He's trying to understand this because it's so shocking. And it's important that we know that we have this story not filtered through the passage of time.
Yeah.
So it happened, and it's the immediate facts as he knew them at the time, as he was perceiving them at the time. He doesn't know things that we know now about what happens to Henry and his future wives.
Right.
He knows none of that. He can describe Henry's daughter Mary without knowing anything about her reign and the controversies that might have come from that. So he's giving a pure picture of what he sees at that moment. So it's a snapshot.
Yes.
It's a snapshot of the world that he saw at the very time those events take place. And it's essentially new.
Yes.
Right? It's like a reading paper.
Yes, and that's what makes it so astonishing. I mean, so many times when we read about facts of the period, for instance, when Henry VIII had that jousting accident, you know, the idea that he was unconscious for a long period of time, turns out that was something somebody said on the continent who wasn't even there. So then we pretty much dismiss it. And then here we have Carle. It's both time and place, the immediacy of it, and he's there on the ground. Just makes it, to me, such an astonishing thing. And to think that for so long, at least, I'd like to know your opinion on this. Do you feel as well that prior to your translation and prior to your study of Carle and to know these facts surrounding the poem, it seemed to me that it had been dismissed as seen as factual? Has that been your experience in your study of the poem?
Yeah, I mean, it has had a certain amount of attention from a couple of historians. But when they look at facts, or when they look at the poem and can say, this is not true, or this didn't actually happen quite this way,
right,
then they say, well, we should just dismiss it. Instead of saying, so what is this actually telling us? What's underneath the surface here? Does it really matter if it was Francis Weston's mother who said this, or some other ambassador? The point is, somebody said something about this. And
yes.
But we need to understand this more emotionally, and that's what Carle was saying. So yes, there were a few historians who do use it. I don't think that they're always cognizant of the greater context of 16th century French literature and the tropes of literature that you'd have to come to expect. I mean, I talked a lot, for example, before I published this with George Bernard, who used this poem extensively in his book on the fatal attractions, Anne Boleyn's downfall. And he uses the poem to assert that Anne was in fact guilty, and that this poem is kind of proving that point. And so I disagree with that. Of course, there were conversations with him, but look, if he didn't think she was guilty, why does he say X, Y, and Z? Why does he make it sound like she's, the malicious person? And he's not writing just the facts. He's trying to show how he himself processed this and came to a different understanding through the passage of time by observing Anne and her actions. So he doesn't want to cut to the chase if you were writing a letter, maybe,
yes.
But to kind of record this process of thinking about it. So I think there are different ways of reading the text, obviously. His differs from mine. But
right.
So it has gotten some attention. I hope that this allows for even greater attention because I think in the hands of a skilled historian, it could yield even further information about this.
Yes, and as you've said before, too, he is offering the arc of his own understanding of Anne because so many people assumed her guilt, and he's saying basically, so did I. Right? I assumed her guilt, but then this is where I came to, and I don't want to jump ahead here, but so
we can talk about that next.
Who is he writing to? Historically, what has been one of the most essential parts of the poem, which is, like you said, we're nailing it right now.
Right. So I think this is a key to George Bernard's argument, is that when Carle talks about Anne's downfall, he does it in a particular way that no one else actually had, and that's by delivering what I would call a journalistic scoop. Right?
Yes.
He's giving this news, and he tells us exactly how the charges came to be made. So according to Carle, it's a conversation or an argument that happened between a close counselor to the king, who's unnamed, and that counselor's sister, who's also unnamed. And this counselor's sister, in the course of this argument, mentions her suspicions of Anne's incest with her brother. So that's an amazing accusation to make. But the point is that it's coming from Anne's inner circle. So other sources do mention that comes from Anne's inner circle, but Carle dramatizes this as an argument, specifically between siblings with fatal consequences. And here is an example of Carle's interest in the literary and the aesthetic qualities of his text, in addition to conveying news.
Yes.
He doesn't have to put it dramatically.
Yes.
But it's a dialogue. It's presented as a dramatic dialogue between these two individuals. So the argument might very well be a product of Carle's imagination. There might not ever have been an argument between a brother and a sister that led to these accusations. But what's important for us to know is that the accusations arose from those closest to Anne. So that's his long, roundabout way of giving us that bit of imagination. We don't have to take that sort of thing seriously, right? Literally.
Right.
That it had to be an argument between these two people. It's simply that he wants us to know the women around Anne had suspicions.
Yes.
And voiced those suspicions. And then the men, who were more powerful and had closer connections to the king, voiced those opinions or those accusations to the king, who began the investigation.
Yes. And so again, like going back to what we were saying, he's setting the stage for this arc that he begins on Anne's assumed guilt.
Exactly.
So who is he writing to?
Okay, so it's in the form of a poem, but it's a letter. It's what we call an epistle, amateur. And we don't know for sure who it is that he's writing to, what the name of the recipient of this dispatch would be. He doesn't say, dear so-and-so.
Right.
He calls this person Monseigneur, which means my lord. So it's someone who is a high-level dignitary in the court, probably someone who had diplomatic connections in the court, but it's definitely not the king himself. It's not Francis I, because if he were writing directly to the king, he would have used a different word to address it. He would have said sire, sire, or roi, which is king. That's the way you would have addressed the king. So it's someone not at that level, but there are any number of people, 2 or 3, 4 different diplomats or dignitaries in the court of Francis I who could have fit that bill. But in any case, he does say that it's somebody who would probably remember the fact that Anne had been in the French court. So someone who had been around for a good while. And so it's basically almost like saying, oh, yes, you remember Anne Boleyn. She came to France. First
That's so amazing.
Married the French queen, and then stayed around for a while, worked with Claude for a while. So
wow.
He's expecting this person to know her backstory a little bit.
And I love that detail so much. So I think we touched on this already, which is Carle's opinion of Anne as the poem progresses. Can you express that arc now?
Sure. So in the very beginning, he has a pretty negative view of Anne, but I do believe that ultimately he comes to believe that she's innocent. Initially, he says she's flirtatious. She also has malice and evil in her heart. That's a pretty damning accusation to make. He says that she refused to follow the way of her prudent mistress, by whom he means Claude de France, the wife of Francis I, the Queen of France, who is now deceased, but that Carle holds up as this model of virtue. He says that Anne didn't want to follow in those footsteps. When she got to England, she was then free to take on lovers whenever she wanted because the king was so trusting in her. She was capable of being guilty. We get this feeling for the first half of the poem that he thinks she's perfectly capable of doing the things that she becomes accused of doing.
Yes.
But there's a real change in attitude exactly at the midpoint of the poem. This is a very standard practice in a lot of medieval and Renaissance texts. The midpoint changes things. And it's at that point where he starts talking about Anne being imprisoned. And she herself starts to change, he says, that she starts to turn her thoughts to God. And one of the key words that Carle uses repeatedly in this second half of the poem is the word pity, which had a very precise meaning in classical times through the Renaissance, as the emotion that you feel when you're confronted with undeserved suffering. So when he says that he takes pity on these people, he's implying that their suffering is undeserved. And if that's not enough, there's more in the sense that, and I think this is the kind of thing that a historian might not catch, is that there are so many instances of biblical references in the second part of the poem, particularly echoes of the story of Christ's crucifixion.
Wow.
So that is your prime example of undeserved suffering, right? So that is what we would call undeserved suffering. And it's applied to Anne and to her 5 lovers. There's images of Christ's crucifixion. So that's a way of kind of reading between the lines, what you have to do with a poetic text. It's an expectation that you have to bring to a poem that you don't necessarily bring to a historical document. You're not always reading between the lines that way. You're not always expected to bring to the text knowledge of what these words used to mean in classical Greek, knowledge of, of the Bible, and an ability to detect images. And it's a different way of reading a text.
Yeah.
And finally, he also says that she teaches her ladies who are very sorrowful about her situation. She teaches them that there's no need to be crying over this because death is the beginning of eternal life. So he basically makes her a theologian. She gives a theological lesson to her ladies. So that's an astounding thing for a woman to be able to do, to teach a theological lesson at the time.
Yeah.
And I think most importantly, he shows how Anne became proficient in what the 16th century called the art of dying. So to be able to face your death with serenity, especially at the final moments on the scaffold. Because in the 16th century, people believed that you could read the state of a soul as a function of how you approached death. So if you were, upset, that meant that you were probably guilty, but her steadfastness is a sign of her innocence. Now, that's not something we still believe, I think.
Right.
Nevertheless, it was something that was part of that cultural heritage. And so, again, that is something that you have to bring to the poem in order to understand exactly what he's saying. So if you look at, as you like to call it, the arc of this movement, he starts off really admitting that she could very well be capable of doing these horrible, immoral things. And then starts to realize, on the basis of his observations of the way she conducts herself, the words that describing or ascribes to her that, well, maybe it's not the way it appears, and maybe there is something more here. And then he lets us know that he's changing his mind by dropping these words like pity, by dropping in these images of Christ's crucifixion and so forth. It's up to us to tease all that out and to understand.
Well, thankfully we have you as well to help us piece this out, because we might completely, and this is why your book is so important, and your footnotes and everything in it, and I highly recommend it, because you can unpack the epistemology of some of these words because of your knowledge of Old French, and there's so much to a word, its history, its cultural implication, and that's so important to discovering the truth inside of his poems. And that leads to my next question, which is another big word, important word he used. So can you tell us about the different texts you studied in England and France? Manuscript number 10194 in Paris, because that says something more about her character. So I'd love for you to talk about that.
Right. As most of these manuscripts, we don't have Carle coming right out saying explicitly, she is not guilty.
Correct.
But the one manuscript that you're talking about comes as close to that as one could possibly dare to be. So back up a little bit. I looked at a lot of different manuscripts. Every single one that I knew about, I looked at. The base text that I used was the one from the British Library, which is a beautiful object in its own right. It's very carefully produced in italic script. It was clearly done by a professional scribe. It's on vellum or parchment rather than paper. It's got gold edging, gold illuminated letters in the first folio. It's really a lovely object. But I also looked at other manuscripts, mostly in France, especially in Paris, but some in the provinces, Bordeaux, a few other places. Some were in Germany, and one was in Italy at the Vatican, actually. But the most exciting one that I looked at was this manuscript called 10194, which in fact is the polar opposite of the British Library copy, because it is very sloppy. The writing is atrocious. It's very, very difficult to read, and it looks like somebody was writing it in haste, just trying to scribble it out and read it. But it's a very important manuscript because it's the only one that gives the name of the author in its title. It actually says that this poem is a tragedy written by Lancelot de Carle. So that's very important because not all the other manuscripts are anonymous. And so what I had to do, I didn't want to just depend on the one manuscript. I needed to collate all the different manuscripts and all the different variants. And so I had my base text. I listened to the library in Paris, a sweltering summer afternoon, and, going line by line through this. And I was fully expecting it to be identical to all the others, or at least to be close, because most of them are essentially the same. But suddenly I came across a passage that was not in any of the others. And I thought, well, that's odd. And then I kept reading a little bit further, and I came across another passage that had about 8 lines that weren't anywhere else. And I thought, well, this is really strange because nobody has talked about those lines. Nobody has put them in any other edition. They didn't seem to exist anywhere else. But I do think they are critical to our understanding of the poem. Problem was, they were so poorly written, the handwriting was so difficult. It was almost impossible to figure out what it actually said. So I couldn't read it at the moment. I could see that I could make a few words in there, and I thought, oh, this is important. But I needed to get a digital copy of it so that I could work on it in my leisure. I showed it to other people who were better at this sort of thing, at paleography, not Pam, and they threw up their hands.
You had to make a cipher practically to read it, didn't you?
I actually did, and so that's what I did. I spent an afternoon looking at those sentences and saying, okay, so this letter looks like this letter in this other part of the manuscript, and I know that's a P, and I know that's an R, and I know that's an S, and I put them together. And of course, if you know French, you can figure out, well, this is an actual word.
Wow.
and also it's a poem, so once you get the rhyme word, you know it's going to end the same way, than the next line. We're just going to have a certain number of syllables in the line. And so I spent a weekend, just as you're saying, it's like a cipher, trying to figure it out one by one by one. And I think I broke it. I broke the code. And so this is what it says. He says that everyone, on the basis of her mightily steady end, judges her life to have been prudent, and believes that they have committed a great offense in having thought so ill of her. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's just 4 of the lines, and these are the most important lines that are different. So we need to unpack that a little bit. He assigns her the virtue of prudence, and that's a very important fact, because Thomas Aquinas, with whom Carle, as a cleric, would have been familiar, Thomas Aquinas, medieval theologian, said that prudence is the virtue that is needed for holding the passions and the appetites in check. Mm-hmm. So specifically related to passions and appetites. So what we have here is somebody who's saying not that Anne repented, but that we should never have thought her to be guilty. She was not guilty in the first place. And that thinking that, all of us who thought that about her, we were all wrong. And he himself was among those that thought that, because the whole first part of the poem, gives us that impression that he thought that she was perfectly capable of doing these things. And this is, I think, the most explicit judgment regarding Anne. Not that he could prove her innocence, but that people believed her to be prudent and not likely, therefore, to have committed sexual offenses. Yes. So I think these lines would have been very powerful, and I believe that, furthermore, that these lines are the reason that Henry VIII himself, when he came across the poem in 1537, the following year, was absolutely livid when he read this poem, and he ordered that all copies of the work be destroyed and that the author be punished. I think it's because of those lines specifically.
Yes, and I'm not sure if you've ever said this before. I'm just curious. I hope it's not a curveball. But that manuscript in and of itself, what's its provenance? Do we know?
Well, that's an excellent question. So I do have a theory about this. Because, as I said, we know that Henry VIII became acquainted with this poem because he was sent a copy of it by Stephen Gardiner, who was at the time an ambassador for the English in France. So Gardiner came upon this poem and read it and thought, this is interesting, that I think Henry should see a copy of it. Sent it off to him. Henry reads it and is absolutely livid. His secretary, Henry's secretary, Risley, writes back to Gardiner saying, the king is really upset. Tell them they have to destroy all copies of this work. Now, what's interesting about this diplomatic correspondence is that they keep referring to this as a book, a printed book, not a manuscript, but a printed book. Wow. They talk about publishers and then printers. And the interesting thing about that is we don't have any trace of a printed version of this story before 1545.
Wow.
So we're talking 1537. It's very clear that there's a printed version out there. Wow. So it's possible that it was just a pamphlet, something that's ephemeral, something that might not have survived very easily. It's also possible that when Henry insists that Francis destroy all copies, that as a matter of fact, he does destroy copies of the book. And that somehow or other, you're not getting into speculation here, but since I'm not a historian, I'm allowed to do that.
Yes. So am I.
Yeah. Now, what I think we have here is a handwritten copy of the printed text that was about to be destroyed. That somebody in the French court heard about this, it was going to be destroyed, snuck off someplace, and quickly transcribed it.
Yes.
So that it wouldn't be lost for posterity. And that would explain why
So messy.
So messy. And you know how it is when you write quickly, right?
Yes.
The handwriting suffers a great deal. And the reason I think that this is the copy, not the actual manuscript, but that this is the version of the poem that Henry saw, although he read it in a printed version. The reason I think that the manuscript copies that is that, as I told you, this is the title. This is the only manuscript that has that title, that gives Lancelot de Carle as the author, that calls it a tragedy, and that also identifies him as what's called a protonotary, which is basically a secretary. Those are the three ways in which Henry refers to this book. Henry and his secretaries refer to this book in this diplomatic correspondence. He knows that it's Carle. He knows that he was associated with the French ambassador in his helm of Bridewell. He calls it a tragedy, which is exactly the title that's given. And as I said, all the titles of the different poems are different. And he calls him a protonotary. So I think that what we have here is that's the way this book was titled. You know, written by Lancelot de Carle, protonotary, Tragedy of Anne Boleyn. So I think this is the original version of the text that's now lost, and that someone salvaged very hastily, but salvaged it so that it wouldn't be completely destroyed. It gets printed later, 1545, but that version is really atrocious. It's not good at all. It seems unlikely that Carle had anything to do with that version in 1545 because it's got so many mistakes. But I think what was really important were those extra verses, and that maybe later, to keep this poem in circulation, they realized that and they extracted those verses so that it's a little bit
inciting or something.
The censors better, right?
Exactly. That is fascinating, especially correlating the terms that Henry used. It's just fascinating. That's unbelievable. So, going forward in your work, what led you to continue to study how Anne Boleyn was portrayed in French literature, your recent work? And in other words, this work with Carle, it seems to have maybe piqued your interest in how Anne Boleyn has been portrayed in French literature going forward. So what did you find?
So I do think that there's been a lot of discussion about Anne's time in France among the historians, but equally there are these literary texts that have passages that depict Anne's time in France, and people haven't really studied that in any kind of systematic way, and so I gave a little talk on that. So I got interested in this because of Carle's poem, because I believe that his is foundational for this master narrative of Anne's life in France, at a time that we don't have a lot of historical documents for, because after all, no one would have predicted that she would have been that important, right? She was not, a princess. So the first thing he does, Carle, is to talk about her French upbringing, and he tells us that she had assimilated French manners so well that she could be confused for a natural-born French woman. I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with that. That's where this comes from. But there are no other contemporaneous documents that attest to her Frenchness, to her studied Frenchness, right? Although some indicate that she spoke French very well. She acted French in some way. She knew how to flirt. She knew how to use her eyes very well to attract men. But Carle, it's very interesting because he seems to have to walk a very fine line here, because he doesn't want to blame France for instilling morally dubious qualities in Anne, like being flirtatious. So he negotiates this by saying that Anne decided not to follow the good way, the virtuous way that was being shown to her by her prudent mistress, Claude of France, the wife of Francis I. So in other words, he's saying that the French court wasn't corrupt. It was Anne's choice that made her susceptible to becoming flirtatious. And so when later in the poem, when he says that Anne had indeed been prudent, he's saying that Anne did in fact follow the way of her prudent mistress, and that France was in fact responsible for her learning virtue and not vice. So that's another way in which that word prudence comes into play. It's a word that's attached to Claude. Then later in these extra verses becomes attached to Anne Boleyn as well. So I'd say after Carle writes, which is of course in the moment in 1536, there's really not much in literature that depicts this time of Anne being in France until the late 17th century. And there we have a series of novels about the French court. And all of these texts have been translated into English. They're originally written in French, but they have been translated into English. And you could actually locate those online and download copies of these novels if you want to follow up on this. The first one that I want to talk about here is something called The History of Queen Anne of Boleyn, which was written by a woman named Madame d'Aulnoy. And in her telling, she imagines, how did Anne and Henry meet? Well, I guess we sort of think that Henry and Anne met at the court in England, and over time, that spark started to fly.
Right.
But, something that happens gradually over time isn't the kind of thing that's of interest to a novelist, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It has to be something dramatic. And so she imagines that Henry meets Anne at the Field of Cloth of Gold.
Yes.
So it's a very dramatic point. But in her retelling, Anne is a very reluctant mistress to Henry. She has very, very little agency in this novel. It's quite interesting. But she is so innately attractive that she unwittingly captures everyone's attention, including the King of France himself, Francis I. And so then you get a little bit of a triangle there between Francis I, Henry VIII, and Anne Boleyn. And after Henry confides in Francis about his passion for Anne, Francis tells Henry that he loved her too, but he's willing to sacrifice all of that for his brother King, quite generously. And he agrees to act as a go-between. You might even say as a pimp, right?
Yeah.
Between Anne and Henry, to persuade Anne to marry Henry, which she does reluctantly agree to do because she so respects the opinion of the French king.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting vision of the French court. It's not a prudent court of Claude, but was more licentious court of Francis I there. And just about the same time, there's another Frenchman whose name is Jean de Préchac, who writes a book called The English Princess, or The Duchess Queen. And so it's actually a novel about Mary Tudor, Queen of France, where Anne is just a bit player. She is a lady in waiting to marry, and she helps to facilitate a clandestine meeting between Mary and her lover, Charles Brandon, at the French court. So in this scene, Anne Boleyn is very young and very concerned about her own reputation, mainly because she wants to use her reputation for virtue as a tool to seduce men. A very interesting take.
Yeah.
He says, this is the quotation, he says, with so much beauty and virtue, there was no crowned head of whom she might not make conquest. Wow.
Yeah.
So this is a remark that was written by somebody who benefited from historical hindsight.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It's not in the moment. He could attribute to a young Anne Boleyn a claim that really would have been quite shocking to anyone who heard it in 1514 if she actually had said that. So he implies that for her, virtue is a tool and her kit to attract a king's attention, along with her obvious beauty. And the implication is that Anne is not only ambitious, but also shrewd and wily and seductive. So here we see the beginnings of an image of Anne Boleyn as that kind of seductress, one who guns for Henry and possibly even Francis as well. So very different from the other two versions. And then the final one that's also written at exactly the same time period is a very well-known French novel called The Princess of Cleves by Madame de Lafayette. And it's actually about the court of Henry II, who is the son of Francis I, so his successor. And in that novel, there's a very small digression that recounts the story of Anne Boleyn. And it's recounted by a character in the novel who is, in fact, Mary, Queen of Scots, who is living in the French court at that time. So in her digression, Frances is smitten again with Anne. She mentions, too, the influence of Marguerite de Navarre, the sister of Francis I, through whom Anne Boleyn receives she puts it, the imprint of the new religion. So that's a loaded term from the perspective of the Catholic Queen Mary, Queen of Scots. That's a negative thing that she learned about the new religion. But Anne doesn't just learn about religion. She's also learning about love. And Anne, like Mary Tudor, is described as being amorously inclined. That's the word that she uses. And the French word is galant, but it should be translated as amorously inclined. So France, again, is this place where you can learn dangerous things. Dangerous things about love, dangerous things about religion. This is very, very different from what Carle, I think, ended up doing with his vision of Anne Boleyn in France.
Yeah, and I very much believe this was the beginning of the downfall of Anne's reputation in literature and film.
Absolutely. See that. Particularly the negative portrayals of Anne, they start to come through just about this time, especially with this Princess of Cleves, which I think has parallels in many French poems from the late 16th century that are written around this time. And these all show, quite remarkably, the influence of Sander and this arch-Catholic apologist, Sander, who says all of these nasty, negative things about Anne. And you can see bits and pieces of this coming through just at this time. And Sander becomes very, very popular in France, especially after the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots.
Yes.
Who was the French Dowager Queen. She was married to Francis II. So the French thought of her as one of their own, a French queen. So they were absolutely appalled when Elizabeth decided to execute their queen.
Yes.
And so they attacked Elizabeth vehemently in these poems, as I said, and so many other texts. And one strategy to attack the daughter is to attack the mother.
Yes.
So Anne Boleyn's sort of like collateral damage in this effort to discredit Elizabeth. And that's where you get these images of her as being physically monstrous and this immoral woman. And I think it's in France, anyway, the French representations.
Yes.
I think the catalyst to that is the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots.
That's just completely fascinating, because it sounds like we can pinpoint this point in time where the French were so angry at Elizabeth I that they chose to rewrite Anne's history in France this way. And then that has reverberated through the halls of history, been picked up by historical fiction writers, filmmakers, and it really comes down to this one moment in time.
It's my opinion. That's my opinion on this. Now, others, I think, would probably say it's probably an oversimplification, but it does seem to me to be striking that so many of these negative things go back to, or are always post-dates. And
that just explains everything. This explains her bad reputation as it's viewed in numerous accounts and numerous historical fiction, novels, film. I mean, it's just so fascinating that you pinpointed this point in time. That's really the causality of Anne's reputation in literature.
Yeah. So ultimately, it's a question of religious differences.
Yes.
Too. I mean, the sort of played out this conflict between the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, and they identified themselves as the Catholic country, even though at the time there was a lot of religious unrest going on and a rise of the Reformation at that time as well. But the people who were writing tend to be people who were pro-Catholic, and that's part of what was going on here.
It's how we got Sander, so it's, you know.
For sure.
And so I think it's an extraordinary find in your research. And in my opinion, it vindicates Anne. It removes her from a lot of ill opinions of her. And it really starts with, like you said, Carle's work being foundational to that. So historical fiction often affects how we view the historical Anne, which is basically what we're talking about now. And which can be problematic. But at the same time, you previously did a lot of work with your students on how they, and perhaps we, should view historical fiction, because people are still going to write fiction based on these false ideas of her and some of its sources. Firstly, and very importantly, let's look at the sources. You've made a recent and profound discovery in this case. Can you tell us about that?
Certainly. So as I was researching Anne Boleyn's life in France, I came across a lot of work that talked about her musical abilities, and these were skills that they all attributed to her time in France. And in fact, Agnes Strickland, a 19th century historian, makes reference to a French book which she quotes from, and it's called The Mémoires of JoAnn DellaNeva, written in 1537. That's the title of the book, which incidentally you could also download as well, but it's only in French. It has not been translated into English. And that book describes Anne as being very musically talented. And so Strickland takes from that passage, and after that, everybody talks about how musically talented Anne Boleyn was. But I wanted to look into the actual work. So Strickland gives this footnote with this title. I looked it up online, and it was very clear to me that this work was not written in 1537.
Wow.
For sure.
Wow.
Because it contained echoes of Sandon with regard to Anne's appearance, the six fingers, the whole bit. So looking a little bit further, I saw that other people had already looked into this matter, and they knew that this work was in fact a forgery, that it was created in the 19th century by a French scholar whose name was Paul Lacroix, who was an archivist and a librarian in France, and himself a specialist in 16th century literature and history. So it's not an authentic 16th century document at all. But what's interesting is that Strickland seems to have found the only passage in this book that really can be quoted in a serious work of history.
Yeah.
Because the rest of this work is merely pornographic, insofar as it depicts Anne as basically a nymphomaniac who loses her virginity at the age of 12. Of course, we get a little bit of that with Sender as well. Has a series of sexual encounters throughout her time in France, which Laval, or actually Lacroix, describes in very explicit detail. And we won't go into those details, but they are astounding. And
we'll get kicked off YouTube.
Yeah, look it up. But the story ends with Anne becoming the mistress to Francis I, but he discovers that she's not being faithful to him, and in fact he catches her in the act with one of his men and therefore dispatches her back to England. But this series of extraordinary erotic encounters, I just can't believe that anyone would have taken this work seriously as an authentic historical memoir. I cannot believe that Strickland actually read the whole thing. I just can't imagine a Victorian woman reading through this. Actually, seriously, nearly pornographic material. But she must have done, because she pulls out this one paragraph that's fit for serious circle narrative. But that's the kind of thing where I think we do have to be aware of forgeries, for example. Things that look like historical documents but aren't, that were the creation, that are actually imaginative creations. I mean, this is terrible history. It's not actual history, but it's a heck of a good novel. It's steamy, it's a paperback novel.
A bodice ripper.
Exactly. From the 19th century.
Well, and then so many look to Strickland as a good resource, but they're not looking at her sources close enough.
They always have to go to the footnotes.
Amazing.
And track down the original source. Yeah.
I mean, that's just astonishing, really. And again, I feel like in talking to you, it's such a comfort to me, because you're dispelling time after time this trope of Anne. I mean, she was flirty, don't get me wrong, but she was very intelligent in her flirtation. It came from courtly love, extraction, bon mot, and intelligent, witty remarks. It wasn't this overt idea that Lacroix is putting forward through the voice of this Jean de Laval. And I'm so grateful for your work because, again, it just seems to dispel a lot of where the origins are of the myths that instinctually we feel cannot be true based on even the indictment that was given during her trial. She couldn't have been in those places at that time, and there's so many things that point to her innocence. But what I love about your research is that it really proves so much about her character, her true character, and where we get a lot of misinformation about her character in novels and film today. So in your talk, Anne Boleyn's Youth in France, Imaginative Representations in Early Modern French Literature, you succinctly point out that, quote, literary depictions more easily thrive when hard facts cannot get in the way of a good story. So looking at the idea of literature as entertainment versus historical fact, what do you usually discuss with your students? This whole discussion has been wonderful because we're really separating fact from fiction. But what can we benefit from historical fiction, and how do you teach your students?
Great. Well, clearly I'm going to go to bat for literature because that's my bread and butter, right?
Right.
That's a thing in its own right. But yes, when I talked about the literary depictions thriving when facts don't get in the way of a good story, I mean, historians know that there are gaps in the documentation. And I know that is, I'm sure, very frustrating for them. They have to stop there. Yeah. They might be able to speculate and fill in a few things here and there, but basically it's a dead end for them when the documents don't exist. For the literary writer, on the other hand, that's exactly what they want. Yeah. What they head for, right?
Right.
Because that's where your imagination can really thrive. And so I want my students to understand that history and literature are distinct, but they might be intertwined. And that's the whole point of the courses that I've done on this. Specifically, I don't want them to dismiss literary accounts just on the basis of the fact that they aren't historically accurate. I mean, I've heard so many other podcasts or I read these comments as, oh, don't read that, it's not historically accurate.
Yes.
Well, no.
Yeah.
You can still read it and get something from it. They need to do different things. And so if there are discrepancies in a novel or any literary text from history, that's the moment to think about why.
Right.
So perhaps those discrepancies are due to a religious or a nationalistic agenda, as we've touched on a little bit here, or they might reflect the prevalence of misogyny in a society that often thought ill of women. And I think all of that plays into the case for Anne Boleyn that we've been building here. But sometimes the discrepancies are there simply to convey a different level of truth. And that's up to us to disentangle. So I think this is very important. And I'm going to go off topic here a little bit. Still Tudor, but not Anne Boleyn.
Sure.
There's a play called The Book of Thomas More that Shakespeare collaborated on. And he didn't write very much, but he was assigned to write this one passage about how Thomas More quelled the English rioters during the evil May Day riots in 1517. And so the English were upset about the foreigners who were living in London, taking over their jobs, competing for their women, and all sorts of terrible things. So they start to riot. Thomas More arrives on the scene and gives this speech. Now, this speech is absolutely magical. It speaks so movingly about the plight of refugees. It asks the English citizens to imagine themselves in similar circumstances as strangers in a foreign land. And you can actually look this up on YouTube. There's a wonderful rendition of this by Ian McCullen. It's called The Stranger's Case. Wow. So if you want to look that up, it's just a beautiful, beautiful speech. And the English crowd is mesmerized and convinced by More's speech. However, it's pure fiction. More's involvement here is absolutely pure fiction, but its historical inaccuracy shouldn't be preventing us from appreciating its beauty and from understanding its function in the play, because it's a device that moves the play forward. It's the moment where Thomas More gains the attention of the king, who then makes him rise through the ranks. So it moves the plot forward that way.
Yes.
But more importantly, it shows More as this morally upright, sensitive, good Christian man who commands respect instantly. So the playwright doesn't actually say those words. Say, Thomas More is a good Christian man who commands respect. Instead, he shows us through this beautiful speech. So this is, to me, a very good way to understand how literature and history have their own goals. You want to convey this idea of what Thomas More was like? Well, this is a way to do it without being blunt about it, without saying the mere facts. And it's harder to disentangle these sorts of things. It's the way I think we've been talking about Carle's poem. It's harder to disentangle literature to find out what that level of truth is. But we need to kind of scrape away. We need to delve in, and we need to bring all kinds of knowledge, a little knowledge about the Bible and theology and philology and all sorts of things in order to fully understand those texts. So I'm an advocate for literature.
Yes. And, you know, it's interesting because in a sense, he's using Thomas More as the mouthpiece for something powerful to say about a historical event. Who better than if I used Thomas More to do this? And also, like you said, at the same time, it's saying something about More's character to the audience. So Absolutely. It is fascinating. Yeah.
This is a set piece. A lot of people look at this particular passage, which we know, in fact, was written by Shakespeare, because it's the only bit of text that we have of one of his plays where he wrote it in his own hand. We have the autographed copy of it. It's at the British Library. Another thing that makes it even more special.
Yes.
But it is absolutely beautiful. The rest of the play is not so good.
Yeah.
It's not on the same level. You know, if you were to read this and I said to you, there's one passage that Shakespeare wrote and the rest is written by just basically a bunch of amateurs, you would be able to find the text that Shakespeare wrote because it's so extraordinarily beautiful. So we need to appreciate literary texts in a completely different way from historical texts. They both have things to say about people and events, but they say them in different ways. And it might be harder for us, and we're not always trained to read poetry or to read literature, to dive into it quite the way that we need to in order to unveil those truths.
Yes, it's just so fascinating because we're using the power behind the historical facts to create good literature, or the power behind a certain persona in order to get an idea across. It's that age-old question of where does art and life, where do they intermingle, where are they separate? And I love how you respect literature for literature's sake and also respect truth and are able to make those distinctions. And for myself as an artist, you know, we have the term artistic license because you're creating something that might not be truth but expresses truth, if that makes sense.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I couldn't have said it better.
Wow, I'm honored because I love the way you express yourself. Well, in conclusion then, I think it's interesting that Anne, when it comes to her connection to France, began as a lady-in-waiting to a pious queen, Queen Claude. And it is in Claude's court where Anne grew more cultured and intelligent and where she honed her important skills, which would later help her to not only become a successful lady at court, but very unwittingly, as we've talked before, with not her intention in the past, but unwittingly, queen of her own country. So would you mind taking a moment to tell us why it's so important to recognize what was likely Anne's mindset while she was in the court of France, and why it's not vital not to view the facts of Anne's life backwards, which so many do, as these examples of early modern French literature have done. This is key because, again, I think it affects the current incarnations of Anne in books and film. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's incredibly difficult not to read a story backwards
when
we know how it ends. And you hit on a point that's, I think, very important, because we do know how it ends. And it's very easy to go back to Anne's time in France and say, look, she's learning how to be a queen. And I think that's problematic. We have to be very careful about how we express that, because certainly she was learning skills. She was learning how to be a good lady in waiting. She was learning piety and all of those other things. And she may have been absorbing lessons about what a good queen does, but she should probably never have been thinking about being queen herself. I just can't imagine that she would have at that age, at that stage of her life. Because if this were her conscious goal, to become a queen and to learn how to become a queen, you'd have to admit that she basically intends to be a home wrecker. There would have been no other way for her to become queen.
Right.
That's similar to what I said, Préchac says, that there's no crowned head of Europe that she couldn't conquer. You know, that's his reading the story backwards, right? And I don't think is fair to her. I think it's actually a pretty scandalous thing to say, in my opinion, that she was trying to learn how to be a queen. We have to be very careful about that.
Yes.
So, she wasn't a princess like Mary Tudor, who could, in fact, and should be imagining herself as marrying a king or marrying an emperor. This would have been totally unprecedented. So, as I said, certainly she was learning to be a good servant to a queen, but we have to be very careful about saying that she was learning to be a queen herself.
Yes,
At least I hope she wasn't thinking about that.
Yes, and I've heard people say this before in documentaries and things. Who knows? Maybe she was thinking she could be queen herself, and it doesn't make sense. Also, from the standpoint of, I look at her age and her intention for being in these courts, which was to become a good lady in waiting to the queen. Her expression to her father in her letter that she hopes she does it well and how honored she would be. And I also think of ourselves. What if that were us? We're young ladies, we're teenagers. I realize time was a little different developmentally with age then. 15 then was practically an adult. I understand that. But at the same time, she's still somewhat of a child, a young person, even in that time period. And I can't imagine if I was going to go somewhere and I'm learning these skills, I would be very anxious to want to please Queen Claude and to do things well, because then I'm going to go, let's put it in my own context, serve the First Lady. The last thing I'm thinking of is becoming the president's next wife. I'm thinking, how can I make the First Lady happy? She's thinking, how can I make Catherine happy? And she says that in that letter to her father. So we have proof that she was thinking the way we're discussing, that she was only thinking of the moment and doing her job well as a lady in waiting, both at the courts where she was learning to be one and where she anticipated going in England.
Yeah, I agree. I think she couldn't possibly have been thinking of that. If we say that, then we have to understand the consequences of saying that, and that goes back to playing into those tropes of Anne as the seductress, an ambitious woman, a wily woman. And if you don't want to go there, then you really can't at the same time claim she was consciously taking notes on how to be a queen. Things don't go together.
Exactly. And that, JoAnn, is why I'm so grateful beyond measure for your research, your incredible insight, your knowledge of French literature, the Old French language. All of these things are so instrumental to unpacking who Anne truly was, and also how we perceive her in literature, and disentangling truth from fiction, but also appreciating fiction and truth for what they are in and of themselves. So I'm so grateful for you, and thank you for being with me today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. The pleasure was mine.
Thank you, JoAnn.